The floorboards bit at the soles of Anwei's feet, a persistent gnawing cold that defied the meager fire struggling in the stone hearth. It was a cold that lived in the bones of the house itself, a permanent resident in the chinks of the log walls her late husband John had so poorly sealed. Outside, the snow was a silent, suffocating blanket, erasing the path, the world, everything but the stark loneliness of this forgotten notch in the mountains. She measured her existence in scoops of rice and the slow, agonizing burn of a dwindling woodpile. John had promised her a life of golden abundance, a house built of strong American timber, but he had only delivered a grave on a frozen hillside and a cabin that seemed to sigh with the weight of his failures. She wore his gray wool scarf over her shoulders, a coarse shroud over the worn red silk of the cheongsam she kept on beneath her layers. The red was a memory of a different life, a defiant ember of who she had been before this land of vast, empty promises had tried to extinguish her. A sudden heavy thud against the outer wall startled her, a sound too dense for falling snow, too solid for a beast. She froze, her hand hovering over the pot of thin broth, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. Silence returned, deeper than before. She waited, listening to the crackle of the fire and the frantic beat of her own blood. Another sound, a groan this time, low and guttural, muffled by the snow. It was human. Fear warred with a deeply buried instinct, a flicker of humanity she thought this place had already starved out of her. Cautiously, she moved to the single grimy window, rubbing a clear circle into the frost with the heel of her hand. A shape lay near the woodpile, a mountain of dark furs and tangled hair half buried in a fresh drift. It was a man, impossibly large, and he was not moving. Anwei stood at the door for a long time, the cold air rushing in to steal what little warmth she possessed. The man was a giant, a creature of the wilderness she had only glimpsed from a distance. Men who lived and died in these mountains, spoken of in hushed, fearful tones in the nearest settlement, a place she hadn't seen in months. To bring him inside was a risk beyond measure. He could be a bandit, a madman, a killer. But to leave him outside was a sentence of death, and she knew the feel of that sentence intimately. His stillness was what decided it. There was no threat in it, only a profound and final surrender to the cold. Steeling herself, she stepped out, the snow swallowing her thin slippers. It took all her strength, a desperate, grunting effort that tore at her muscles and left her breathless, to drag him across the threshold. He was a dead weight of muscle, bone, and wet fur. Inside, he filled her tiny home. His head nearly touched one wall, while his feet brushed the other. She managed to roll him onto his side, his face slack, a thick, dark beard matted with ice, and a trace of blood from a gash on his temple. His hair, long and wild, fanned out across her floorboards like a dark river. He was breathing, the exhalations shallow, ghosting in the frigid air of the room. She worked methodically, her fear receding into a focused urgency. She peeled away his heavy, soaked furs, revealing a frame that was all corded muscle and old scars. There was a deeper wound on his leg, a vicious tear that had bled sluggishly onto his deerskin trousers. She cleaned it as best she could with boiled water and precious strips of clean linen, her hands trembling slightly as she worked around the sheer bulk of his thigh. She covered him with her own thin blankets, a futile gesture against his immense size. For 3 days he drifted in a feverish haze, muttering words in a language she did not understand, a rough, melodic tongue that sounded like stones tumbling in a creek. She fed him spoonfuls of broth, tipping his massive head back, feeling the strange fragility of this giant. She watched him, this intruder, this enormous variable in her carefully managed decline. He was a disruption of her solitude, a terrifying and perhaps fatal act of compassion. She found herself sleeping in the chair by the fire, a poker resting beside her, her eyes never straying from him for long, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, a mountain breathing in her house. On the fourth day he woke. His eyes opened, the color of moss in the deep shade of a forest, and they held a startling clarity. He looked at her, then around the small cabin, his gaze taking in the repaired cracks in the clay chinking, the neatly stacked firewood, the single cup on the small table. He didn't speak. He simply watched her as she moved, his expression unreadable, a deep stillness in him that was different from his previous unconsciousness. It was a willed quiet, an act of observation. Anwe offered him a bowl of broth, her hands steady now. "You should eat," she said, her voice quiet, unused to filling the space with anyone else. He pushed himself up slowly, the movement a testament to a strength that was returning with unnerving speed. The cabin seemed to shrink around him. He took the bowl, his hands, calloused and scarred, dwarfing the simple ceramic. He drank it down in slow, deliberate swallows, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. It wasn't menacing, but it was charged with questions that neither of them knew how to ask. He finally gestured to his injured leg, then to her, a clear question. "You were in the snow," she explained, her words careful. "I brought you in. The wound needed cleaning." He nodded, a slow, grave dip of his head. He looked down at the clean bandage, then back at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than stoic observation in his eyes. It was a flicker of something raw, something that looked like disbelief, or perhaps gratitude so profound it had no words. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Phelan," he said, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. It was the first word he had spoken, and it seemed to shake the very air in the cabin. She understood. She placed a hand on her own chest, over the red silk. Anwe. The exchange of names felt monumental, a treaty signed in the quiet space between two solitudes. It did not make him less of a stranger, but it made him less of a threat. He was Phelan. He had a name. And for now, he was a guest in her house, a wounded giant who drank her broth and watched her with the patience of a mountain. Phelan healed with the stubborn resilience of a wild thing. Within a week, he was moving about the cabin, his limp pronounced but manageable. He never spoke much, communicating instead through action. The day he was strong enough to stand for more than a few minutes, he took the axe from beside the door, gave her a questioning look, and when she nodded, he went outside. The sound of his chopping was a powerful, rhythmic heartbeat in the frozen landscape, each strike a definitive blow against the encroaching silence. He worked for hours, until a stack of firewood taller than she was stood neatly by the door, a bulwark against the winter. He didn't stop there. He noticed the persistent drip from the roof in the corner, and with a focus that was almost reverent, he climbed up and worked with materials she didn't even know she had, scraps of timber and tar her husband had left to rot. Soon, the dripping stopped. He moved through her life like a quiet force of nature, mending the broken things Gian had left behind. He rehung the cabin door so it no longer scraped against the floor, and sealed the drafty window frames with packed moss and clay. He did it all without a word of instruction, simply seeing a need and meeting it with his immense strength and surprising dexterity. His hands, which could have snapped a man in two, were gentle as they worked, his movements economical and precise. Anwe watched him, a strange feeling blooming in her chest. For months this cabin had been a cage of sorrows, a monument to her husband's failures. But under Phelan's care, it was slowly becoming a shelter. He ate what she offered without complaint, his appetite enormous, but his manners gentle. He took up his space, which was most of the cabin, but he did so with a quiet consideration she found disarming. He would fold his long legs to sit on the small stool that was laughably tiny beneath him, and he would sleep on the floor by the hearth, wrapped in his furs, never once making a move toward her cot. He was creating a space of safety, not with words of reassurance, but with the solid, undeniable language of labor and respect. He was a guardian, not a guest. And slowly, imperceptibly, the The fear she had felt began to transform into a fragile, tentative trust. She started leaving the poker by the hearth instead of beside her chair. One evening a storm blew in, a blizzard that howled and clawed at the small cabin, throwing fists of snow against the window pane. The wind shrieked through the pines, a sound of pure, untamed fury. Inside, however, it was warmer than it had been all winter. The fire, fed by Phelan's endless supply of wood, blazed cheerfully, casting a warm, dancing glow across the small room. The door held firm against the gale. The roof was silent and dry. Phelan sat on the floor, sharpening a skinning knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape a soothing counterpoint to the storm's chaos. Anway was mending one of her husband's old shirts, her needle dipping in and out of the worn fabric. The silence between them was no longer heavy or uncertain. It was comfortable, a shared space of quiet companionship. She looked up at him, truly looked at him, and was struck again by the sheer impossibility of his presence. He was a colossus contained within her tiny world. His broad shoulders seemed to brush against the ceiling beams he had reinforced. His knees were drawn up to his chest, and still he seemed to fill every inch of available space. He was a creature of open skies and endless forests, folded into this little box of a room. A small, unbidden smile touched her lips. He glanced up, his moss-green eyes catching the firelight, and saw her expression. He paused his work, a silent question on his face. "It's this house," she said, her voice soft. "It is so small. And you are so big." She gestured with her hand, a small motion encompassing him and the room. "You're bigger than my house." She meant it as a simple observation, a moment of gentle absurdity. She expected him to chuckle or nod or perhaps say nothing at all. Instead, something in his face shifted. The stoic mask crumbled, and a look of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow washed over him. He turned his head away from her, toward the fire, but she saw the tremor that ran through his massive shoulders. He set the knife and stone down with a careful, deliberate slowness. A single, ragged breath escaped him, then another. He brought a hand up to cover his face, and she realized with a shock that he was crying. He made no sound, just a deep, silent, internal weeping that seemed to shake his entire frame. The giant in her house, the man who had wrestled her life back from the brink of collapse, was crying because she had called him big. In that moment, all remaining fear vanished, replaced by a wave of fierce, aching tenderness. He was not just a protector. He was a man carrying a wound so deep that a simple, innocent observation could break it wide open. He did not speak of it that night, and she did not ask. She simply sat with him in the warm silence, the storm raging outside, and let him have his grief. The next day the world was buried in white, the silence absolute. The air in the cabin had changed. The wall he had kept between them, a wall of quiet duty and careful distance, had been breached. He was still quiet, but his eyes sought hers more often, holding her gaze for a moment longer than before. A new language was forming between them, one spoken in shared glances and small gestures. That afternoon, as she was kneading dough for bread, he came and stood beside her, watching her hands work. "I had a son once," he said, his voice a low, rough thing, as if the words themselves were stones he had to pull from his throat. Anway stopped kneading, her hands white with flour. "He was small, so small." Phelan stared out the window at the endless white, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. "My wife, she said I was too big, too loud. She said my hands were made for breaking things, not holding them. When the boy got sick, she said I scared him. She said my shadow was too dark." The pain in his voice was a raw, living thing. He had been exiled by his own size, made a monster in his own home. His strength, the very thing that had saved Anway, had been twisted into a curse against him. "They're gone now," he finished, his voice barely a whisper. "The sickness took them both. I came here so my shadow wouldn't fall on anyone ever again." Anway felt her heart ache for him. She understood now. His tears the night before were not for himself, but for a memory of being told his very nature was a threat to those he loved. She reached out, her flour-dusted fingers gently touching his forearm. The muscle beneath her hand was like granite. "Your hands," she said softly, "are not for breaking. They fixed my roof. They cut the wood that keeps me warm. They are gentle." He looked down at her small hand on his arm, his expression one of utter desolation slowly giving way to a fragile, dawning hope. He did not pull away. He simply stood there, letting her touch him, a silent acceptance that felt more intimate than any embrace. The scent of baking bread soon filled the small cabin, a scent of home, of life, of a new and delicate beginning. As the weeks passed, the deep snows of winter began to recede, and a fragile spring breathed life back into the mountains. The bond between Anway and Phelan deepened, settling into a rhythm of shared days and quiet evenings. He taught her things about the forest, which roots were edible, how to read the tracks of animals, how to predict the weather by the feel of the air. She, in turn, shared parts of herself she had long kept locked away. She told him about her home across the ocean, about the taste of her mother's cooking, about the beautiful, intricate stories painted on silk screens. She even unpacked the small, lacquered box she had kept hidden and showed him the delicate brushes and inkstone inside. She began to paint again, small, simple images of mountain flowers and birds on scraps of paper. It was a part of her she thought had died with Gian. Phelan would watch her, his expression one of quiet reverence, as if he were witnessing a miracle. A soft romance bloomed in the spaces between their words. It was in the way he would leave a rare, beautiful wildflower on the table for her in the morning, or the way she would save him the best portion of the stew. It was in a shared smile across the fire, a lingering touch when he handed her a tool, the comfortable weight of his presence beside her as they watched the sunset paint the peaks in hues of rose and gold. One evening, he returned from a hunt with a young deer slung over his shoulders. As he worked, dressing the animal with an efficient grace, she came to help him. Their hands brushed, and this time he caught her fingers in his touch surprisingly gentle. He turned her hand over, tracing the lines on her palm with his calloused thumb. "Your hands are so small," he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "They make beautiful things." He lifted her hand and pressed a soft, hesitant kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of a shy, hopeful reverence that it made her breath catch in her throat. She felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, not as a fragile widow or a foreign curiosity, but as herself. She stepped closer, into the circle of his warmth, and rested her head against his chest. His arms came around her, enveloping her in a safe, strong embrace. He smelled of pine and earth and wood smoke. He was home. Their fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of 3 men on horseback. They rode up to the cabin as if they owned it, their faces hard, their eyes greedy. The man in the lead was stout and florid, with a cruel twist to his mouth. Anway recognized him instantly. Fisk. The man to whom Gian had lost everything in games of chance and drink. He was the reason she was stranded here, the architect of her misery. "Well, well," Fisk sneered, his eyes sweeping over the repaired cabin, the neat woodpile, and finally settling on Anway. "Looks like the little bird has been keeping her nest tidy." His gaze flicked to Phelan, who had stepped out of the cabin to stand in front of her. Fisk's eyes widened slightly at Phelan's size, but his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "And what have we here? Found yourself a big dog to guard the hen house?" Phelan said nothing. He simply stood there, a silent mountain of a man, his presence a solid, unmovable fact. His stillness was more intimidating than any threat. "I've come for what's mine," Fisk announced, swinging down from his horse. "This cabin, this land, It's all mine now. The debt is past due." "The debt was a lie," Anwei said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped out from behind Phelan to stand beside him. This was her fight, too. "You cheated my husband." Fisk laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "He was a fool who didn't know when to walk away. And you, my dear, are part of the property. I'm a reasonable man. You can work off his debt." His meaning was sickeningly clear. His leering gaze made her skin crawl. But the fear that would have once paralyzed her was now tempered by a cold, hard anger. She looked at Phelan, at his steady presence beside her, and felt a surge of strength. She was not the same woman who had huddled by a dying fire, waiting to be extinguished. She had survived. She had rebuilt. She would not be broken now. "This is my home," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. "You are not welcome here. Leave." Fisk's face purpled with rage. He was not used to being defied, especially by a woman he considered his property. "You think this beast will protect you?" he spat, gesturing dismissively at Phelan. "He's just a dumb animal. One bullet is all it takes to put down a big dog." He drew a pistol from his belt, the metal glinting menacingly in the afternoon sun. The two men with him shifted, their hands moving toward their own weapons. The air grew thick with tension. The peaceful clearing suddenly transformed into a stage for violence. Phelan didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself more fully between Fisk and Anwei. His moss-green eyes were fixed on Fisk, and they held no fear, only a deep, cold calm that was utterly chilling. "You will not touch her," Phelan said, his voice a low growl that vibrated in the air. It was a statement of absolute fact, not a threat. It was the mountain declaring it would not be moved. For a moment Fisk hesitated, caught off guard by the sheer, immovable certainty in Phelan's voice. In that instant of hesitation, Anwei acted. She didn't have a weapon, but she had a mind sharpened by months of survival. She grabbed the heavy iron skillet from the fire pit where she'd been preparing to cook. With a cry that was part fury and part terror, she flung it with all her might. It spun through the air, catching Fisk's horse on the flank. The animal shrieked in pain and reared violently, its hooves lashing out. Fisk, standing too close, was knocked off his feet, the pistol flying from his grasp as he crashed to the ground. The other two men, startled by the sudden chaos, were slow to react. That was all the opening Phelan needed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He was not a wild beast. He was a force of focused intent. He disarmed one man with a single powerful blow that sent the rifle spinning away, and shoved the other back with such force that the man stumbled into his own panicked horse. It was over in seconds. There was no prolonged fight, just a swift, decisive, and overwhelming display of protective strength. Phelan stood over the sputtering, winded Fisk, his shadow falling across the smaller man like a shroud. He didn't say a word. He just looked down at him, and in his eyes was the promise that if Fisk ever returned, the mountain would, indeed, break him. Fisk and his men scrambled to their horses and fled, casting fearful glances back at the silent giant and the small woman who stood beside him. They left a cloud of dust and the lingering stench of their cowardice in the air. The clearing was quiet again, the only sounds the chirping of a bird and the gentle whisper of the breeze through the pines. Anwei's legs suddenly felt weak, the adrenaline draining out of her, leaving a profound, trembling exhaustion in its wake. The heavy skillet lay on the ground, a humble, domestic object that had become a weapon of defiance. Phelan turned to her, his face etched with concern. He reached out, his large hands hovering near her arms, as if afraid to touch her, to see if she was all right. "Anwei?" he asked, his voice soft, the thunder gone. She looked up at him, at this man who had come into her life as a wounded stranger and had become her anchor, her protector, her heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a deep and overwhelming love. She launched herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest, clinging to the solid, steady warmth of him. His arms closed around her, holding her tight, his hand stroking her hair. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "You are safe." She looked up at him, her hand coming up to cup his bearded cheek. "We are safe," she corrected him softly. In that moment, the last of their solitude fell away. They were no longer two lonely people sheltering from the world. They were a unit, a partnership forged in hardship and sealed in courage. The cabin behind them was more than just wood and stone. It was a home they had built together, not just with their hands, but with their healing hearts. The world outside was still vast and uncertain, but inside this small space, contained within the circle of each other's arms, they had everything they would ever need. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, but Phelan's shadow no longer felt dark to him. It fell over Anwe, not as a threat, but as a promise of shelter, a shield against the world, a place of belonging.